Bernard Lewis is widely recognized as one of the West's leading authorities on the Middle East. In the wake of September 11th, the Princeton historian's views are said to have had a strong influence on George Bush and his foreign policy. His latest book is called The Crisis of Islam: Holy War and Unholy Terror.
Now, in explaining terrorism against the West, you have said, and I quote here, "They hate us because they resent us." Your new book, The Crisis of Islam, looks at the historic roots of Islamic resentment towards the West. What are they? What are the big principal things that cause the roots of that resentment and Muslim rage?
Well, there are several aspects to it. One, take the larger general civilizational aspect. For the first 1,000 years of the 14 centuries of Islamic history, Islam was always advancing somewhere. It had its defeats, its setbacks, but these were more than compensated by other advances. As late as the 17th century, there were still Turkish pashas ruling in Budapest and Belgrade, Turkish armies besieging Vienna, and Barbary corsairs raiding the coasts of England and Ireland. So that it was still an advancing society, despite, as I said, some setbacks at the remote extremities like Spain and Portugal. From that point onwards, everything seemed to go wrong. They lost battle after battle, province after province, and found themselves outpaced and outperformed by the West, not only in the battlefield, but in the marketplace, in the schoolroom, and every other area. In our time, they have become acutely aware of this. Thanks to modern communications and modern media, there is now a sense of humiliation and what they see the infidel world triumphing over the true believers, which has become much more powerful than at any time in the past. Now, this is reinforced by the feeling that now it is their turn and that they are again victorious. The most important single factor in that, I think, was the defeat of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. We tend to think of this as a victory of the West in the Cold War. That's not how they see it. They see it as a victory of Islam through the long, bitter struggle in Afghanistan, which ended with the retreat and defeat of the Soviets who had invaded Afghanistan, and after that, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, as they see it, they had tackled the larger, more dangerous, more vicious of the two superpowers of the infidel world. Now it was time to deal with the other one, and this they thought would be comparatively easy. As they see it, the Americans are soft and pampered. One finds this refrain again and again in their writings.
Yeah, it's hard for us to understand the contempt that especially the fundamentalists have for the weakness
as they
of the
see
West.
it, the Americans have become soft and pampered. One reads this again and again: hit them and they will run. And then they repeat the same litany: Vietnam, the Marines in Beirut, Somalia. Now, what happened in Somalia? As we in the West see it, this was a well-intentioned attempt to bring help to a country in civil war and misery, when the intended beneficiaries proved murderously ungrateful. They thought, well, to hell with that, we're getting out. As they see it, this was an attempt to establish American imperial domination in Afghanistan, and was defeated by the heroic struggle of the Somali Muslims. Now, why anyone in his right mind in America would want to accept responsibility for Somalia, in addition to all the others, passes understanding. But that is how they see it. They see this as a victory of the Islamic struggle against American imperialism. Then come the 90s, when one attack after another is made on American institutions or barracks or individuals, none of which occasions any kind of response that is serious. You get angry words and misdirected missiles, and that's about all. This strengthens the impression. And again, this is not just my reading of it, this is what they say quite explicitly. They have gone soft, pampered, hit them and they'll run. This is the background of what happened on 9/11.
The UN report on development, chronicles that the Muslim world is significantly behind virtually all the rest of the world, save sub-Sahara Africa,
Yes.
when it comes to democracy, modernity, human rights. The most controversial part of the analysis of why this is so hints that maybe part of the problems are inherent in the Muslim faith itself. For example, the absence of the separation of church and state. You want to expand on that for me?
Well, this is a debate which has been going on in the Muslim world for a very long time now. They have been aware of the changing relationship between Islam and, to put it in their terms, between Islam and Christendom. They have been aware of this, they have been arguing about it since, well, one might even say the debate begins something like 300 years ago with the first major Ottoman military defeats. And now it is an agonized question all over the Islamic world. Why is it that we are falling behind and they are advancing? And now it's becoming even worse. In the past, they had to struggle with the disagreeable fact that the industrial West, Europe and America, had outpaced them, outperformed them. Now they have to face the fact that even places like Korea, which half a century ago were far behind them in every respect, are now far ahead of them. So clearly there is something radically wrong in their society. Of this they are very well aware. Remember, we are not dealing with primitives. We're dealing with an old civilization with long traditions, a very keen sense of history. Now, when you become aware that something is wrong, there are two ways you can approach it. You can ask, what did we do wrong? In which case, the next question is, how do we put it right? What are they doing right? What is there that we might adopt or imitate? That is the way which has been followed by many in the Muslim world. The other way is to say, who did this to us? And this leads you into a twilight world of paranoia and conspiracy theories. And that, of course, is the response of many others. Now, broadly speaking, the answers fall into two categories. There are the ones who say what is wrong is insufficient modernization. We have not kept up with the modern world. We have allowed others to outpace us, and the remedy is to catch up with them. This was the argument of Kemal Atatürk, for example.
Right, in Turkey.
The founder of the Turkish Republic, a great apostle of modernization. He argued once, he said it's idle to talk of this civilization or that civilization or meetings between civilizations. He said at any time in human history there is one civilization that is modern. There is modernity. He said there is one civilization at the time that is modern civilization. The others are dead or dying. We have to become part of that modern civilization or we fall behind. That is one approach, and in various forms one finds it also elsewhere. The other is to say, no, what is wrong is too much modernization, meaning too much imitation of the ways of the West, too much imitation of Western institutions, Western mores, and so on. For these people, the West is degenerate, corrupt, immoral, and its influence can only be bad.
With the exception of Turkey and to some extent Morocco also, who have developing democracies, I guess, rather than full democracies. I mean, democracy has not flourished in the Muslim world at all. Again, what's the explanation there?
Well, the unfortunate fact is that the destruction of democracy is largely a Western achievement in the Islamic world. When they became aware that the West was more powerful, they tried to westernize, which is very natural, including westernization of government. And what this usually meant was adopting the worst Western models. Westernization did two things. It strengthened the central power by placing at the disposal of the government the whole modern apparatus of surveillance and repression, so that even a petty tyrant today has greater power than the legendary sultans and caliphs of the past. The second thing that it did was to weaken or abrogate the intermediate powers. In the traditional order, the authority of the ruler was limited by all kinds of vested interests and established groups in society.
Civil society, or the organization.
Civil society, if you like, by the urban bourgeoisie, by the country gentry, by the military establishment, the religious establishment, and so many others. This is not democracy, but it is limited responsible government. Now that was destroyed by modernization, which strengthened the government and weakened the limitations and placed, as I said, the whole modern apparatus of government at their disposal. Now the worst example of this is what we see now in Iraq. Now people talk about the government of Iraq as if that is the Arab Islamic model. That is arrant nonsense.
You've written extensely how, in fact, it doesn't resemble the traditional Islamic form of governance at all.
I mean, the roots of Saddam Hussein's regime are not to be found in the Arab past or the Islamic tradition. They come straight from Europe. During the late 19th and early 20th century, a number of attempts were made to introduce European-style government. They experimented with parliaments, with constitutions, with elections, all things which were previously unknown in the region, but which seemed to be working in the West and therefore would be good to imitate. They all failed. They were not suited to the society. They withered and died, or were overthrown by violence. The one model that worked was the one-party state. This was introduced from Europe, and we can date it precisely. In 1940, after the French surrender, the French-mandated territory, Syria, Lebanon, remained under Vichy control and was therefore a launching pad for Nazi influence in the Arab world. It was open to them, and from there they tried to move into Iraq with some success for a while, even establishing a pro-Nazi regime, which, however, was overthrown by British and Allied forces, and elsewhere. Now, that was when the Ba'ath Party was found, the ideological, ultra-nationalist, anti-democratic party, which is not just a party, as we understand that term in the Western world, but is part of the apparatus of government. The Ba'ath Party is modeled on the Nazi Party, and when they switched from Nazi sponsorship to Soviet sponsorship, it needed very little adjustment to work. This is the one European political importation that really worked.
You've also drawn an interesting perspective on the role of oil and oil royalties, in fact, working against democracy in many of the Muslim countries. Explain that.
Yes, well, you know, the famous saying, no taxation without representation. Unfortunately, the converse is also true. No representation without taxation. Middle Eastern governments, in receipt of massive oil royalties, didn't need to raise taxes from their people, and therefore didn't need representative bodies to help them in assessing and collecting taxes. One of the main motivations for the development of democratic institutions was missing. And that is, I think, unfortunate, or worse than unfortunate, a tragic consequence of the oil royalties.
You have been very, I don't know, careful, but adamant in making the point that not all Muslims are fundamentalists, not all fundamentalists are terrorists, but that the terrorists that we are experiencing today, the Al-Qaeda, the Osama bin Laden form of terrorism, does have its roots in the basic philosophy of Islam, that the history, the philosophical underlying tenets of that religion. Explain that to us.
No, it does not have its roots in the basic philosophy of Islam. I would put it differently. Let me go back a step. We use the word Islam in two senses. We use it as the equivalent of Christianity. That's to say, a religion,
right,
in the narrow sense of the word, belief, worship, organization. We also use it as the equivalent of Christendom, meaning an entire civilization shaped by that religion, but including many elements that are not part of that religion, or may even be hostile to that religion, but nevertheless arise within this civilization. Now, one has to say that Hitler and the Nazis arose within Christendom, but I don't think you could say that they arose from Christianity. This is the distinction which I think it's important to bear in mind. These terrorist movements certainly arise within Islamic civilization. in the same way that Hitler and the Nazis arose within Christian civilization. But that doesn't mean to say that they have their roots in basic Islamic philosophy. I would say quite the contrary.
The concept of Shi'ad is religious-based. The notion that an individual's first identity is their religion rather than their ethnic or their national identity with the Muslim world.
Yes, that is true. I mean, the idea of identity defined by ethnic or territorial nationality is new in the Islamic world, and it's still very imperfectly assimilated. You can see that dramatically if you look at the map of the Middle East and North Africa. The frontiers were drawn by statesmen with rulers on maps, and mostly by English and French statesmen, not by Middle Eastern statesmen. It was the Anglo-French settlement after World War I that determined the shape of the modern Middle East, drew the frontiers. And even the identities defined by these frontiers, with few exceptions, are new inventions, imperialist inventions, if you like, with either invented names or names dredged up from antiquity. I mean, names like, shall we say, Libya, Syria, Palestine. These are names from the political geography of the Roman Empire. They had entirely disappeared during the period of Islamic rule. They reappeared with Western influence and then Western rule in the region. The names Algeria and Tunisia don't even exist in Arabic. They use the same word for the city and the country. Algiers and Algeria, Tunis and Tunisia are the same word in Arabic. I mean, this whole notion of the ethnic territorial nation is new.
Well, how about that in terms of that imperialism? I mean, there are some who say that if you really want to understand why the Muslim world has fallen behind, the West has to bear some responsibility for that, that we've currently supported repressive regimes. After World War I, the West artificially created countries that for which there was no real basis, and that the British imperialism, kind of even before that, destroyed domestic economies.
The interval of direct imperial rule in the Middle East was very short. It began after the First World War, and it ended after the Second World War. The problems started long before the imperialists arrived, and continued, getting worse indeed, long after their departure. So while Western influence is certainly an important factor, Western imperialism, in the sense of direct rule, is very minor. And one could even say that the main crime of the imperialists was that they didn't stay long enough. If you look at countries which were under imperial rule for longer periods, like India and Indonesia, they're doing much better.
Your new book takes us through the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, and particularly looks at something I wasn't very familiar with at all, Wahhabism, a very extreme and militant form of Islamic thinking. Describe that to us.
Wahhabism is named after its founder, Muslim theologian who lived in Najd, which is in northeast, the far northeast of the Arabian Peninsula, in the 18th century. He felt that Islam had become corrupt and degenerate, that the Muslims had abandoned the authentic principles of the faith as brought to them by the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century, and he set about what he called a cleansing of Islam. Now, this began in Najd. He succeeded in converting the rulers of the tribes of Najd, the House of Saud, the ancestors of the present Saudi royal house, and was very successful. He and they managed to establish Wahhabi doctrine in Najd, and then they tried to take it out of Najd into the rest of Arabia and even into Iraq, but they were crushed at the time. And the Ottoman Empire, although by then declining and weak, was still strong enough to deal with that. And the Wahhabi movement was crushed. It reappeared in the 20th century, this time much more successfully. And they created the Saudi Arabian kingdom, which Wahhabism was the official doctrine. Now, Wahhabism is a very extreme form of Islamic fundamentalism, totally intolerant of any degree of difference from their own view within Islam. Their hostility was directed mainly not against non-Muslims, of whom there were none in Arabia, and with whom they were not primarily concerned, but against Muslims who did not measure up to their standards. So its intolerance and repression initially was directed purely against fellow Muslims, against Shiites, for example, against Sufis, followers of the mystical form of Islam, and so on. But then two things happened which gave Wahhabism an enormous impact. One of them I just mentioned, the creation of the Saudi kingdom, which meant that the Saudi ruler now had at his disposal the resources of a kingdom, and not just any kingdom, but the one that included the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, giving him enormous prestige in the whole Muslim world, and also control of the pilgrimage, which every year brings Muslims in their millions to visit the holy sites. This naturally gave an impact to Wahhabism, which you could not otherwise have had. The other thing was the discovery of oil and the enrichment of the Saudi establishment with these enormous revenues. So they suddenly had at their disposal a kingdom, enormous religious prestige, and unlimited funding. And they have used that to carry their message all over the Islamic world, and more dangerously, beyond the Islamic world, to Muslim communities living in non-Muslim countries, in Europe and North America especially.
We're always led to believe that Saudi Arabia is the best friend of the West.
Well, there are different ways of measuring friendship.
Now, on part of Wahhabism, or certainly that extreme point of view, you hear this from Osama bin Laden often. And in fact, I think you've gone as far as saying his real target is not the West long-term, but regimes that he sees as supportive of the West. Yes. Explain that for our viewers.
One sees this again and again. I mean, obviously, the external enemy is important for them, and they do believe that there must be an ultimate showdown between the two rival religions, the only two universal religions in the world, Christianity and Islam. If you like, I can come back to that. But the main task, yes, is the overthrow of existing regimes. And this emerges very clearly in all these fundamentalist movements. Some of them are quite explicit about it. The group, for example, that murdered Sadat. Now, the common Western explanation was that Sadat was murdered because he made peace with Israel. That isn't true. Now, the people who murdered him did not want peace with Israel. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting that they had no objection to it. But that wasn't the main point. For them, the peace with Israel was a symptom, not a cause. It was the symptom of the kind of thing that ungodly governments of the kind they reject will perpetrate.
Some have said that the problems that we're experiencing with the Muslim world right now will never be solved until there is a solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Do you buy that? Is it that simple?
No, I think this is nonsense. By that, I don't mean to suggest that the Palestine-Israeli conflict is unimportant. It is not unimportant. It's very important. But the continuation and unsolvability of this conflict is a consequence, not a cause, of the greater conflict. It is important, but it is, as I say, its unsolvability is a consequence. Every time they seem to be moving nearer to a solution, it breaks down. I would put it this way, that every time there is a serious danger that peace might break out, some new terrorist action prevents that danger.
What is the prescription there? I mean, some have gone as so far as that there will never be harmony within the Muslim and the Western world until the Muslim world becomes more secular, more modern, and more democratic. Do you go that far?
I wouldn't include the word secular necessarily. Secular in English has a rather wide meaning. In French, they use the word laïque, which means separation of church and state. Right. And it has no negative connotation regarding religion. The word secular, as we use it in English, implies not just non-religious, but even anti-religious for many people. So I hesitate over the word secular. But some form of separation between religion and government, I think, is a necessary condition. There will be no peace or contentment within the Islamic world until they modernize. But that, of course, leads to many discussions as to the precise meaning of modernization. One crucial issue, for example, which has been raised very frequently within the Muslim world, less so by outside observers is the position of women. Now, modernization, I think, must include social and educational modernization. And I cannot see how they can overcome this without facing the problem of the position of women in society. Regarding democracy, one has to be careful what one means by democracy. There is a tendency nowadays, particularly in the English-speaking world, to assume that democracy is the natural and normal condition of humanity, that any departure from it is either a disease to be cured or a crime to be punished. I don't share that view. They will have to evolve their own form of government. But what I think is possible and desirable and can really be achieved in these countries is to evolve a kind of government which is civilized, humane, above all limited and responsible. And for that there are ample precedents within the Islamic tradition.
If the answer to the problems that the Muslim world is facing right now lies within the Muslim world, what does that suggest about the role of the West?
I don't think we can change them. One doesn't do that. It was possible at a certain stage to bring radical changes by ruling a country for centuries. But that is not on the cards now. It will not happen, at least not from the West. There are other possibilities. But what we can do is refrain from obstructing their progress and perhaps help them to remove obstacles.
Give me an example of what that
As I suggested before, the regime in Iraq is a direct result of European influence. This is a European model, which was introduced from Germany, fostered from Russia. Now, the Nazis have gone, the Soviets have gone, Saddam's regime is bereft. They are looking for a substitute for the Nazis and the Soviets elsewhere. They think they have found one in Europe. I hope they're wrong on that.